He was a poor single father, a war veteran haunted by the ghosts of battle, who only wanted to give his little girl a place to call home. When he spent his last savings on a forgotten plot of land in the mountains, everyone laughed. "That place is cursed," they said. But the day he unlocked the door of the old wooden shed, everything changed. Inside, the darkness waited something older than time, a secret buried beneath the earth, glowing like the breath of a sleeping fire. What he found would test his faith, awaken miracles, and prove that some flames are lit not by men, but by God himself. Before we begin, tell me, where are you watching from? Drop your country in the comments below. The morning mist clung to the pines like breath held too long, and the world felt suspended between memory and silence. The truck creaked along the frost-bitten road, its paint dulled and scarred from years of use, carrying within it a man, a child, and a dog, all three chasing a promise too fragile to name. Jack Halden gripped the steering wheel with weathered hands, veins raised like cords beneath his tanned skin. 38 years old, with a lean, angular build hardened by labor and war, he carried the quiet gravity of someone who had seen too much and spoken too little. His dark brown hair, streaked faintly with gray, fell just past his ears, and a weak stubble shadowed his jaw. His eyes, gray-blue like the cold sky over Kabul, were haunted yet resolute. He had been a soldier once, and though the uniform was long gone, the war had not left him. It lived behind his eyes, in the twitch of his fingers when the world went too quiet. His voice, when he spoke, was soft, almost tender, because he had learned how sound could break fragile things. Beside him sat Lila Halden, his daughter, 8 years old, small for her age but alert in that watchful way of children who grow up around silence. Her hair, the same chestnut hue her mother once had, curled in soft waves under her knit hat. She had her mother's eyes too, hazel, warm and wondering, but they had learned restraint from her father. She didn't ask where they were going. She already knew that home wasn't a place. It was wherever her father decided to keep trying. She pressed her forehead to the window, drawing little circles on the fogged glass, whispering the names of shapes in the drifting clouds as if trying to invent a gentler world. In the back seat, sprawled across a worn army blanket, lay Ranger, their German shepherd, 6 years old, large and broad-shouldered with a thick coat of gray and black fur. His muzzle had begun to lighten with age, but his amber eyes still burned sharp with vigilance. He had been Jack's service dog during deployment, trained to detect danger, loyal to a fault. To strangers, Ranger was intimidating, a silent, intelligent presence with a soldier's patience. But to Lila, he was warmth and safety incarnate. The dog's ear flicked with every sound, his gaze following the frost dancing across the truck window. The road narrowed as they climbed higher into the Montana hills, the sky whitening to ash. Jack's gaze flicked to the folded paper map resting on the dashboard. The ink had faded, but the name Silver Creek was still legible. He exhaled through his nose. "Almost there," he murmured. Silver Creek had once been a small mining town, its glory long gone, its residents too. Now, it existed mostly in whispers. When Jack told people he'd bought land there, the responses had been laughter or pity. A veteran buying cursed soil, typical, but he hadn't cared. The property was cheap, nearly worthless. To him, that made it perfect. The land had been listed by a man named Frank Tolliver, a realtor from Helena, who had the leathery complexion of someone born under the sun and a permanent squint from skepticism. "You sure about this, Mr. Halden?" Frank had asked, handing over the deed with yellowed fingers. "That place has been abandoned for decades. Folks say the last owner went missing, left everything as it was. Whole property gives people the creeps." Jack had only nodded. "Then no one will bother us." Frank had grunted, shrugged, and signed the papers. "Well, it's yours now. Good luck out there. Just don't expect neighbors or phone signal." Now, as the truck rolled into the clearing, Jack finally saw what his money had bought. The field stretched wide and uneven, tufts of dead grass bending under the wind. A sagging fence ran along the perimeter, its wire half swallowed by vines. At the far end stood an old wooden shed, its roof patched with tin, leaning like an exhausted man against time. Jack parked the truck and stepped out, boots sinking into soft mud. The air was damp, heavy with the smell of pine sap and moss. Lila jumped down after him, her breath clouding in the cold. Ranger followed, stretching, sniffing the wind, then circling close to Jack's leg. "This is it?" Lila asked, her small voice uncertain. Jack managed a smile, though his lips barely moved. "Yeah, kiddo, home sweet home." She looked around. "It's quiet." He nodded, scanning the tree line. "That's the point." But even as he said it, he felt something watching. Maybe it was the weight of stillness, or maybe it was just his nerves, years of waiting for things to go wrong. He knelt, picked up a handful of soil, let it crumble through his fingers. "Not much to look at," he muttered, "but it's ours." Ranger trotted toward the shed, nose to the ground. The dog paused at the door, sniffed, then growled low, his tail stiff. Jack frowned. The shed door was carved with a strange mark, a circle enclosing the letter R, etched deep into the wood. Time had smoothed the edges, but it remained deliberate, purposeful. "What is it?" Lila asked. Jack brushed the carving with his thumb. "Maybe the initials of whoever owned it before." Ranger's growl deepened. Jack stood, clapped the dog's shoulder. "Easy, boy. Nothing here but old timber." They spent the rest of the day unpacking. The truck bed held little. 2 duffels, a tent, a few pots, a toolbox, and the folded American flag that had draped over Claire Halden's coffin. Jack unfolded it once more, smoothing the creases, then tucked it carefully into a wooden crate near the fire pit. That night, they camped beside the truck. The wind hissed through the grass, carrying faint whispers from the forest. Lila fell asleep quickly, curled in her blanket with Ranger lying protectively beside her. Jack sat awake, staring at the shed. Moonlight silvered its edges, and the carved R gleamed faintly. He rubbed his temples, fatigue warring with unease. Then he heard it, a soft metallic clatter, faint but distinct. It came from within the shed. Ranger's head snapped up instantly, ears erect, a low rumble in his throat. Jack's pulse quickened. He rose slowly, his hand reaching for the crowbar leaning against the truck. The sound came again, a hollow scrape, then silence. He glanced down at Ranger. "Stay," he whispered, but the dog took a step forward, muscles coiled. The moon drifted behind a cloud, plunging the clearing into shadow. The world seemed to hold its breath. Jack stood frozen, eyes fixed on the dark seam of the shed door. He told himself it was the wind or an animal trapped inside, or maybe just old wood settling. But deep down, a soldier's instinct stirred, the sense that something unseen was moving, something waiting. He took one slow step closer. Ranger followed, silent now, tail low. The air felt colder near the shed. The smell of rust hung thick. Jack could hear his heartbeat in his ears. For a moment, he thought he saw movement behind the slats, a flicker of reflected light. Then it was gone. He stood there until the silence swallowed him whole, then turned back to the fire. "Tomorrow," he murmured. "We'll see tomorrow." Behind him, the shed gave one long creak, as if exhaling after 100 years of sleep. The morning came gray and damp, the kind of morning that made the world feel half-formed. Mist crawled low across the field, curling around Jack's boots as he walked toward the shed. He hadn't slept much. Every time he closed his eyes, he heard that faint metallic sound again, steady, deliberate, like something knocking from the inside. Ranger had barely rested either, pacing beside the tent until dawn, his nose twitching at every change in the wind. Lila still slept, curled beneath her blanket, clutching the worn, stuffed bear that had survived every move they'd made since her mother's passing. Jack stood before the shed door, the carving clearer now in daylight. The circle enclosing the letter R seemed freshly cut despite the layers of dust and rot, its grooves deep and sharp. He ran his fingers across it, frowning. The old instincts that had kept him alive in war whispered in his ear. This wasn't random. He turned the handle. It groaned but refused to move. Rust had welded it shut. He fetched his crowbar and wedged it into the crack, bracing his boot against the frame. The wood shuddered, gave a long protesting scream, and finally broke free. Dust poured from the gap like breath after suffocation. The smell hit him first, iron, oil, and time. Ranger stepped in before Jack could stop him, tail stiff, nose low. The interior was dim, the air thick and heavy. Shafts of pale light pierced through holes in the roof, revealing scattered shapes, a broken chair, a rusted anvil, and what looked like the skeleton of a workbench buried under debris. Jack's pulse quickened. Whoever had used this place hadn't been a farmer. He stepped inside, his boots crunching over shattered glass and curled nails. The silence hummed with age. On the far wall hung a row of old tools, hammers, chisels, pliers, their handles blackened with soot. A forge's remains lay in the corner, a rusted mouth gaping open. "Looks like someone worked metal here," he muttered. Ranger sniffed at the floor, then barked once, sharp and low, before pawing at a patch near the back corner. Jack knelt beside him. The planks were loose there, warped but not broken. He pried one up with the crowbar. Beneath it lay a small metal box coated in grime. His breath caught. The lid came free with a pop, revealing a few folded papers and a tarnished brass pendant shaped like a circle split by a jagged line, almost like a lightning bolt. The papers were brittle, written in faded ink. The handwriting was careful, elegant, but strong. Across the top of one page was a name, Reuben Cross. Below it, a short note. "Fire remembers what men forget. When all else turns to ash, the forge endures." Jack's brows knit. The name meant nothing to him, but the words stirred something. An echo of duty, or perhaps warning. "Dad?" Lila's small voice came from behind. She stood in the doorway, wrapped in her blanket, her hair tangled, eyes wide from sleep. "You're already working?" "Couldn't sleep," he said, softening his tone. "Come see this." She stepped inside hesitantly, her boots leaving small prints in the dust. "It smells funny." "That's age," he said with a faint smile. "It's older than both of us together." Ranger nudged the brass pendant toward her with his nose. She picked it up, the symbol glinting faintly in the dim light. "What's this mean?" "I don't know yet," Jack replied. "But I think whoever owned this place left it for someone to find." A voice startled them both. "You folks the new owners?" Jack turned sharply. A woman stood just outside the door, holding a woven basket in both hands. She was in her 40s, tall and willowy, with sun-browned skin and streaks of silver through her auburn hair. Her eyes, green and clear, had the directness of someone who'd lived her whole life in open country. She wore a heavy wool coat over a flannel shirt, jeans tucked into weathered boots. Her name, as she soon introduced herself, was Sarah Lindell, a widow who ran the small general store down the mountain. "Didn't mean to startle you," she said, her voice warm but edged with caution. "Saw smoke last night and figured someone had finally bought the old Cross property." "Cross?" Jack repeated. "You mean Reuben Cross?" Sarah nodded, stepping closer. "That's right, blacksmith, way back when Silver Creek was a real town. My granddad used to talk about him. Said he built this forge with his own hands, then vanished after the big fire of '91. Folks around here called him the Forgotten Smith." She looked at the shed with a mix of respect and unease. Some say he cursed the land before he disappeared. Jack's jaw tightened. "You believe that?" Sarah gave a small shrug. "I believe stories start for a reason." Her gaze shifted to Ranger, who was watching her intently. "That's a fine dog you've got there." "His name's Ranger," Lila said proudly. "He used to work with my dad in the army." Sarah smiled, but there was sadness in it. "Then he's seen more than most people, hasn't he?" Jack studied her for a moment. There was something grounded about her, someone used to hardship, to surviving on little. "Appreciate you stopping by," he said finally. Sarah handed him the basket. "Bread and preserves. Welcome to Silver Creek. If you need anything, fuel, tools, advice, I'm the only store within 30 miles. "Noted," Jack said, and she turned to leave. As she walked down the trail, her figure faded into the mist, her boots leaving dark prints that filled quickly with water. After she disappeared, Jack looked again at the note in his hand. "Fire remembers what men forget." He folded it carefully and tucked it into his jacket pocket. The day passed in quiet work. They cleared the shed, hauling broken boards and debris into piles. Underneath years of dust, the structure was sturdier than expected. Lila hummed softly as she swept the floor, and for a moment Jack allowed himself to imagine peace, a life rebuilt from ruin. Ranger, never far, kept circling the shed, pausing often near that same corner where the box had been. Late in the afternoon, while Jack was repairing a broken hinge, Ranger began growling again, low, steady. Jack turned. The dog was staring at the ground where the loose planks had been. "What is it, boy?" Jack asked, wiping his hands. Ranger pawed the dirt, ears pinned back. Jack fetched his spade and dug where Ranger indicated. The soil came up dark and damp, releasing a faint metallic odor. Then the spade hit something solid. He crouched and brushed the dirt away, revealing the outline of what looked like another lid, wood reinforced with iron bands. "Dad?" Lila whispered. Jack's heart pounded. "It's okay," he said, though his voice sounded far from steady. "Looks like a cellar door." He cleared more of the soil, revealing a small iron ring set into the center. He gripped it and pulled, but it refused to budge. The hinges groaned, unmoving. "Swollen shut," he muttered. He tried again, straining, and at last the wood shifted with a deep creak. A burst of stale, cold air escaped, carrying with it the scent of rust, oil, and something else, something older, deeper, almost alive. Ranger barked once, sharply, and backed away, tail low. Lila clung to Jack's arm. "Dad, maybe we shouldn't," but Jack couldn't stop staring into the darkness beneath. Faintly, very faintly, he thought he saw a glint, metal catching what little light crept through the cracks in the roof. He swallowed hard, forcing himself to breathe. "Tomorrow," he said finally. "We'll look tomorrow. It's getting dark." He replaced the planks and covered the hole. That night, long after Lila had fallen asleep, Jack sat beside the fire, staring at the shed. The wind shifted, and for an instant, the faintest echo drifted from within, like the distant ring of a hammer striking steel. Ranger's ears lifted. He stared into the darkness, his low growl joining the whisper of the wind. Jack whispered to himself, "What are you trying to tell me, old man?" The next morning broke with a cold that bit through wool and bone alike. The sky above Silver Creek was a sheet of pale steel, the kind that promised snow by dusk. Jack Halden stood outside the shed with his breath steaming in the air, crowbar in one hand and determination in the other. Sleep had been impossible. The echo of that faint metallic ring haunted him through the night. Now, as Ranger circled the shed, nose twitching, and Lila clutched her thermos of cocoa, Jack knew he couldn't wait any longer. He had to know what lay beneath. The ground around the hatch was slick with frost. Jack set down his tools, crouching to brush away the remaining dirt. The iron ring gleamed faintly where he'd cleaned it the day before. "All right, buddy," he said to Ranger, who sat beside him, tail thumping once in the mud. "Let's see what your nose got us into." He wedged the crowbar under the ring, leaned his weight into it, and the hatch groaned, reluctant but yielding. A rush of air escaped from below, cold, ancient, heavy with the scent of earth and iron. Lila's breath caught. "Dad, what's down there?" Jack angled his flashlight into the gap. The beam cut through the dark, revealing a wooden ladder descending into what looked like stone walls slick with moisture. "Looks like a cellar," he said. "Old but solid." Ranger barked softly, tail low, but not fearful. Alert. Jack's soldier instinct twitched. He recognized that tension, the kind that comes right before a discovery or a disaster. He looped a rope around a beam, tied it to his belt, and glanced at his daughter. "Stay here with Ranger. If anything happens, you go straight to the truck." Lila's small chin trembled, but she nodded. "Be careful." He smiled faintly. "Always am." Then he descended. Each step moaned beneath his boots. The air grew colder as he went, until his breath clouded in front of the beam of his flashlight. The ladder ended on stone, smooth, deliberate, carved by hands that had known their craft. The chamber was larger than he'd imagined, its walls braced with wooden beams blackened by age. Dust and cobwebs clung to every surface. Jack swept the light across the room. He saw work tables, shelves lined with jars of rusted nails, a rack of old tongs, and at the far wall, a forge. It was enormous, its iron mouth yawning open, chimney curving up into darkness. The surface of the anvil beside it was scarred with hammer marks deep enough to hold rainwater. He exhaled slowly. "My God." Behind him he heard claws scraping wood. Ranger descended carefully, paw by paw, his body tense but obedient. The dog's amber eyes glowed in the flashlight's halo. Jack reached down to steady him, feeling both comforted and unsettled by the animal's quiet bravery. "Come on, boy," Jack whispered. "Let's take a look." They moved deeper into the chamber. Every sound was amplified, their breathing, the faint drip of water, the soft crunch of dirt beneath their boots and paws. A table stood near the forge, cluttered with brittle pages and metal fragments. On one of the sheets, Jack saw familiar handwriting. He lifted it carefully. The page was covered in sketches, circles, arcs, and what appeared to be mechanical designs, pulleys, bellows, something that might have been a furnace system. At the bottom, one phrase stood out, written in dark ink still legible after all this time. "The hearth below shall live when the world above forgets." Jack swallowed hard. Reuben Cross. The name echoed softly through the chamber. Then Ranger growled. The dog's gaze fixed on a corner where the stone wall met the floor. Jack followed it with his light and froze. A shape jutted from the wall, a small door or panel of iron, its surface engraved with that same circular emblem, the letter R. The edges were dark with soot, but the mark gleamed faintly, as though touched by unseen fire. Jack knelt, heart hammering. The door had a keyhole, and hanging from a hook nearby, so corroded it was nearly invisible, was a small iron key. He took it, turned it in the lock. To his surprise, it clicked smoothly, like it had been waiting. When he pulled the handle, the door opened with a whisper of old air. Inside was a recess no bigger than a suitcase. At first, it seemed empty. Then the light caught on something wrapped in oilcloth. Jack reached in and drew it out. The fabric crumbled under his fingers, revealing a book bound in dark leather, edges lined with tarnished brass. He brushed away the dust and opened the cover. Inside, the first page read, "Journal of Reuben Cross, 1890. The handwriting was bold, deliberate. Jack flipped a few pages, scanning entries filled with sketches of machines, notes about heat and pressure, metallurgy formulas. Then the words turned darker. "The fire took my family. I will not let it take memory. The forge will remember. It will endure when we cannot." A chill ran down Jack's spine. The man had been a craftsman, yes, but also a survivor of grief, someone who'd lost everything and built something to fight forgetting. It was a kind of madness he recognized too well. He sat on the stone floor, staring at the journal, the echo of his own losses ringing in his mind. Claire's laughter, the hospital lights, the folded flag. His throat tightened. Maybe that's what drove every man to build, to fight the silence left behind. Ranger whined softly, pressing his head against Jack's knee. Jack reached down, resting his hand on the dog's fur. "It's okay," he whispered. "We're okay." Suddenly, the flashlight flickered, once, twice, then steadied. Jack frowned. He tapped the casing, but the beam trembled again. And for an instant, he could swear the forge across the room glowed faintly, an ember deep inside, like the last breath of a long-dead fire. The hair rose on the back of his neck. He aimed the flashlight directly into the forge, but the glow was gone. Only soot and shadow remained. He heard a noise then, soft, rhythmic, tap, 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 like a hammer striking metal. Jack stood slowly, pulse spiking. Ranger barked once, sharp and loud, then froze, hackles bristling. The tapping stopped. Jack turned toward the ladder, intending to leave, but then the beam of his flashlight caught on something on the far wall, a series of words carved directly into the stone. "Fire is memory. Labor is life." The same phrase from Cross's letter. He closed the book, tucking it into his jacket. "Let's go, boy." They climbed back to the surface, emerging into the gray light of afternoon. Lila ran to them, her face pale. "Dad, are you okay?" "I'm fine," he said, forcing a smile. "Just found something interesting." She looked toward the shed. "I heard something. It sounded like knocking." Jack froze. "When?" "Just now," she said, "while you were down there." He crouched, cupped her face gently. "It's all right. It's just the wood settling." But when he looked at Ranger, the dog's ears were still high, eyes fixed on the ground beneath the shed. That night, Jack couldn't bring himself to open the journal again. He sat by the fire while Lila slept, staring at the hatch now sealed beneath the tarp. The wind howled through the pines, carrying the scent of cold metal. In the distance, so faint it could have been memory, came the sound again, tap, 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 and beneath it, something like a whisper rising from the earth. Ranger lifted his head, growling low. Jack whispered into the dark, "What are you, Reuben?" The wind didn't answer, but the forge below seemed to breathe. The snow began that night, soft as breath at first, then thick enough to bury the tracks of anything that moved. Silver Creek slept under a shroud of white, but in the clearing where the old forge stood, The world did not rest. Inside the tent, Jack Halden lay awake, listening to the wind claw at the canvas. His daughter, Lila, slept beside him, her hand curled around Ranger's collar. The dog's breathing was steady, but his ears flicked toward every sound, the whine of the wind, the creak of trees, the faint, impossible echo that rose from beneath the ground. Tap, tap, tap. Jack sat up, rubbing his temples. The nightmare had returned again, fire, metal screaming in the heat, and Claire's voice calling his name from somewhere he could never reach. He stepped outside, boots crunching in the fresh snow, and looked toward the shed. The tarp covering the hatch fluttered against the wind, snapping like a warning. He grabbed his lantern, its small flame fighting the cold, and crossed the field. Ranger followed silently, a shadow on 4 legs, fur dusted with snowflakes. Jack's breath hung in clouds as he knelt beside the hatch. "We're going to look," he muttered, though it sounded more like a confession than a plan. He lifted the tarp, unhooked the latch, and descended the ladder once more, the lantern swinging gently in his hand. Ranger followed without hesitation. The air inside was warmer than before, not from the lantern, but from something deeper. It smelled faintly of ash, as though the forge had been burning only hours ago. When his boots met stone, he froze. The forge at the far end was glowing. Not brightly, not with the roaring heat of a living fire, but with a faint, pulsing light from within its hollow mouth, like a heartbeat. Ranger let out a low whine. Jack whispered, "It's not possible." He stepped closer. The glow strengthened with every footfall, flickering gold and red like breathing embers. The words carved into the wall, "Fire is memory, labor is life," shimmered faintly, as if heat rose from the letters themselves. He reached the forge and crouched, holding out the lantern. Inside, under the soot, something moved, a flicker of molten light, curling through cracks like veins. He touched the edge of the anvil. It was warm. Jack's heart pounded. "Reuben," he said softly, not knowing why, "what did you build down here?" He set the lantern aside and began clearing the debris around the forge, chunks of coal, rusted tools, scraps of metal that had fused together. Among them, he found a small bellows, a hammer blackened with age, and a set of molds carved from stone. On the handle of the hammer, faint but visible, were the initials R.C. Ranger barked once, sharp, urgent. Jack turned, startled, and saw that the dog was staring toward the wall where the iron panel had been opened the day before. The book, Reuben Cross's journal, was gone. Jack's pulse jumped. He searched the table, the floor, nothing. He'd left it upstairs, he was sure of it, tucked into his coat. His breath fogged the air. Ranger growled again, eyes fixed on the darkness behind the forge. Then came the sound, soft but real, the clatter of a chain, followed by the slow creak of metal against stone. The glow inside the forge flared once, then dimmed. "Easy, boy," Jack said, though his own voice was trembling. He took a cautious step forward. A draft of air brushed his face, cold, then hot, then cold again, like the breath of something vast moving through the stone. He turned to leave. "Come on," he said. "We're done for tonight." But as he reached the ladder, he heard a new sound, a voice, faint as smoke. It wasn't words, just rhythm, like someone humming through iron. Ranger barked again, louder this time, and leapt toward the forge. "Ranger, no!" The dog stopped at the mouth of the forge, barking furiously. Sparks, real, golden sparks, spilled out like fireflies and died before touching the ground. The forge pulsed once more, brighter, then went still. The humming ceased. Jack stood motionless, the hammer still clutched in his hand. Then, quietly, he whispered, "I think he's waking up." The next morning, Sarah Lindell arrived through the snow, her face red from the cold, carrying a basket of supplies. "Heard the storm knocked out power down the ridge," she said as she approached. Her green eyes caught the exhaustion in Jack's. "You look like you haven't slept." He managed a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Guess I haven't." Sarah glanced at the shed. "You've been down there again, haven't you?" Jack didn't answer. She sighed and brushed snow from her coat. "You're chasing ghosts, Jack. My granddad used to say Cross's forge burned long after he was gone, but stories like that only end one way. Bad." "Maybe," Jack said quietly. "Or maybe he built something worth finding." She studied him a moment, the kind of look that weighed pity against concern. "You're a stubborn man." Been told that before. Sarah's gaze softened. Be careful what you dig up, Halden. Some things don't like being found. He watched her walk away, the crunch of her boots fading under the hush of falling snow. Later that afternoon, while Lila played with Ranger near the fire, Jack returned to the shed. He brought wood, nails, and his father's old tool belt, deciding to reinforce the walls and replace the warped planks. Working steadied him. It always had. The rhythm of the hammer against the wood drowned out the questions. But when he struck the third nail, the echo came back to him, wrong somehow. It didn't sound like wood, it sounded like metal. He stopped, pressed his ear against the wall, and heard it again, slow, deliberate, answering his rhythm. One strike for one strike. Ranger growled low from outside. Jack's hands went cold. He hammered again, 3 quick blows. And again, the same number replied. He stepped back, heart racing. All right, he whispered. You win. That night, the storm deepened. The snow rose to the windowsills. Jack sat by the fire, Lila asleep against his arm, Ranger at his feet. The journal lay open beside him, the same one he had sworn he'd left upstairs. Somehow, it was back on the table, its pages open to a new entry written in the same precise handwriting, though he hadn't written a word. The flame remembers its maker. The hand that strikes in faith shall find it waiting. Jack stared at the page until the letters blurred. Then he looked toward the window. The shed was barely visible through the snow, but he could see the faintest red light glowing beneath the boards, steady, living, waiting. He whispered to himself, What did you start, Reuben? Ranger lifted his head, eyes fixed on the door, his ears twitching as though hearing something far away, a hammer, a song, or perhaps the heartbeat of the forge awakening again beneath the frozen earth. Spring came slow to Silver Creek. The thaw melted the snow into silver veins that trickled down the mountain, carving small paths through soil that had slept too long. The pines stood greener now, bending softly under the weight of wind and sunlight. For the first time in years, Jack Halden felt something like peace. But beneath that peace, the forge still called to him. He had spent the past month repairing the shed, new planks, straight beams, a roof that didn't groan when the wind pressed on it. What was once a ruin now stood solid and proud again. He called it the Haven Forge, the name painted neatly above the door by Lila's careful hand. Inside, sunlight reached the stone floor, illuminating the mouth of the old hatch. Jack had reinforced it with a new frame and built a railing for safety. He told Sarah Lindell, who still visited once a week, that he had sealed the underground forge permanently. But that was only half true. In truth, he had gone down there every night since the storm. The same storm that had woken the fire. Each time he descended, the air had felt warmer, the forge steadier. He had found new pages in Reuben Cross's journal that hadn't been there before. Blueprints for tools, diagrams of a water channel, sketches of mechanisms that could harness heat without destroying what surrounded it. The handwriting was the same, strong, deliberate, but the ink was fresh. Jack knew what that meant, and it both comforted and terrified him. On one of those nights, Sarah caught him at it. She had come quietly, bringing him canned stew and kerosene. When she saw the lantern light under the hatch, she called down, "Jack Halden, if you burn yourself alive, I'm not explaining that to your daughter." He'd laughed softly and climbed up to meet her. "I'm not chasing ghosts," he said. "Just finishing what he started." Sarah crossed her arms, her green eyes sharp but kind. "You sound like a man building himself into the past." Jack met her gaze. "Maybe that's where some of us belong." She sighed, handing him the stew. "You don't belong down there, Jack. You belong up here, with her." Lila, hearing her name, poked her head from the cabin door, her cheeks flushed from the fire. "Dad, Ranger found something by the fence." Ranger trotted up proudly, a small object clamped between his jaws, a rusted horseshoe bent nearly into a circle. Jack knelt, pried it gently from the dog's mouth, and turned it in his hand. The metal bore a faint, familiar mark, the circle and the letter R. He exchanged a look with Sarah. "Even the land remembers him," she murmured. That night, Jack couldn't sleep. He sat by the forge with the journal open beside him, the words of Reuben Cross whispering through his thoughts. "The fire remembers. It waits for the hands that understand its purpose. He turned to Ranger, lying near the door, half asleep. Guess that's me now, huh, old boy? Ranger lifted his head, tail thumping once before he rested again. Jack smiled faintly. Yeah, you've earned your rest too. He looked around the room, at the sturdy walls, the warm glow of lantern light, the faint hum that always lingered beneath the floor. The forge wasn't a curse. It was a heartbeat. Over the next few weeks, Jack began using the forge, not the old one below, but a new one he built on the surface, guided by Cross's designs. With Sarah's help and Lila's curiosity, they made small tools first, horseshoes, hinges, nails. Then they built bigger things, a plow blade for a neighboring farmer, a repaired stove door, a new railing for the church in town. Word spread. People came from nearby villages, some curious, some in need. They called the place the Haven, and before long, laughter and hammer strikes filled the clearing from sunrise until dusk. Lila learned quickly, her small hands steady, her eyes bright. She reminded Jack of Claire more every day, the quiet determination, the warmth in her smile. Sarah stayed too, more often than not, helping with supplies and keeping Jack grounded whenever the past threatened to drag him back into silence. But one evening, as the sun bled orange across the ridge, Ranger began to bark wildly. Jack rushed outside to find him standing over the hatch, fur bristled, ears pinned. The air was hot, unnaturally so. He knelt beside the dog and felt it too, a pulse beneath the soil, deep and rhythmic. He opened the hatch, the smell of iron and smoke rising. The forge below was burning again. Not violently, but steadily. Alive. Jack stood for a long time staring into the darkness. Lila came up beside him, eyes wide. Is it dangerous? She asked. He shook his head. No, it's breathing. Sarah joined them, her expression unreadable. Then maybe it's not a curse after all, she said softly. Jack closed the hatch, his hand lingering on the wood. It's a gift, one we have to protect. From that night on, he never went down again. He didn't need to. The forge's warmth seeped upward through the floor, a constant reminder that some fires didn't need tending, they just needed purpose. Years passed. Silver Creek grew alive again. Farmers rebuilt barns, smiths trained apprentices at the Haven, and travelers followed the sound of ringing metal to the valley where a once-forgotten soldier had found redemption. Ranger aged gracefully, his muzzle white as frost, always lying near the forge's doorway. When he passed one quiet morning, Jack buried him beneath the pine tree near the field, marking the grave with an iron pendant engraved with the circle and the letter R. Lila cried softly as she placed her small hand on the soil. He guarded us, she whispered. Jack's voice broke. He guarded the fire. Years later, when Jack himself grew old and his hands too stiff to hold a hammer, he passed the forge to Lila. She rebuilt the hatch one final time. This time with glass panels that let the light below shine upward at night. When travelers came, they could see it, soft red glowing through the boards, eternal. And on Jack's final evening, he sat beside that light, his breath thin but peaceful. Lila knelt beside him, tears catching in her lashes. It's still burning, she whispered. He smiled weakly. Good. That means we did it right. When the morning came, Jack was gone, his face calm, his hands resting on his lap like a man who had laid down the weight of the world. Lila buried him next to Ranger beneath the same pine. On the forge's door, she hung a new sign, forged by her own hands. It bore the circle and the letter R, but beneath it she added one more word, gratitude. At dusk, as the sun sank over the valley, the light beneath the forge burned brighter than ever. Those who passed by swore they could see two shadows standing beside it, a man and his dog, hammering together in silence, their rhythm steady, endless, kind. The fire never died, it simply changed hands. When the fire beneath Silver Creek refused to die, it reminded us of something far greater than a forge or a man's hands. It spoke of miracles, not the kind that fall from the sky, but the quiet kind God places in broken hearts. Jack's story wasn't about gold or hidden treasure. It was about faith, redemption, and the spark that God leaves in every soul, the one that helps us rebuild, forgive, and keep going when the world grows cold. Just like that forge, maybe each of us carries a little fire from heaven, something that can warm others if we choose to share it. When we work, when we love, When we show kindness even in our hardest days, we keep that fire alive. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who needs hope tonight. Comment below where you're watching from and tell us what you believe the real treasure was. And don't forget to subscribe so you never miss the next story of grace, faith, and quiet miracles. May God bless you and your family, and may His light, the eternal flame, keep burning in your heart always.